Nako, ayan na mga kameta. Lumabas na naman yung mga latest results. Pagdating sa inflation, we're also seeing of course some developments pagdating sa US dollar at peso at they're not the most encouraging ito mga kameta. At of course, ito na. Kitang-kita natin na kinikriticize na naman ito si Pangulong Marcos Jr. for practically everything that is happening and of course yung mga critics basta may hindi tama sisisihin sa kanya. Pag-usapan natin ng masinsinan yan shortly. So the inflation guys, mga kameta, ang inflation po ay umabot sa 14-year high at 7.7%. So from around mid 6% ngayon almost 8% na po, no? So lumalapit na siya dun sa double digit at medyo malapit na yung number ng inflation dito sa Pilipinas kumpara dun sa Amerika kung saan nagpa-panic mode na rin yung kanilang Federal Reserve. So exactly as we predicted guys, the US Federal Reserve went with 75 basis point, 0.75% increase dun sa kanilang interest rate again doon sa window na na-identify natin exactly doon sa isang meta natin. So sabi natin in late October to early November there'll be another meeting and almost certainly they'll go with at least around 75 basis point increase. So ang taas na rin yung interest rate ngayon sa US from the mid-range of 3% to lower 4% right now. Ang taas na. I mean, it was barely 1% or so the other year. Ngayon, lampas na siya sa 4%. So every percent is big kasi kung ikaw ay gusto kumita ng marami, deposit ka lang sa US banks, 'di ba? Ang ganda ng interest rates ngayon or bibili ka ng US Federal Treasury bonds para kumita ka. So whenever the US increases its interest rates, maraming perang lumalabas sa mga bansa katulad ng Pilipinas papunta sa Amerika para mas malaking kita nila, 'di ba? So this is a situation we're seeing that has put pressure on Philippine peso. Now, nonetheless, the picture is quite interesting because di ba naalala nyo, nasabi ko, hindi ako masyado naniwala dun sa sinabi ni Joy Salceda, katulad ng yung Sarah All comment niya noon, na I'm not sure na abot tayo na 65, 68. But sabi ko, I'm open to the idea of reaching it 60 or 60 plus. Nevertheless, I express also skepticism on that front because ang aking paniniwala ay there are three things that could prevent the peso from going that far. One is, the Philippine monetary authorities pwede nila i-defend yung Philippine peso by exhausting at least parts ng ating US dollars to defend our domestic currencies. So, I mean, of course, they could go even crazier by imposing capital controls, pero hindi naman tayo sa level na yan. And then the other thing is, malapit na hopefully by December especially, yung mga ating kababayan na OFWs, as they'll be sending more dollars at home, papuntang bahay, pumunta sa Pilipinas, that's also gonna improve yung position ng Philippine peso, no? Because we'll have more US dollar, more reserves, and that could put the downward pressure in US dollar. So in that regard, I'm not completely surprised na we're keeping it around 58, 59, below 59, because in fairness naman sa Philippine government, they have made certain assurances na they will try to intervene to make sure na hindi ito lalampas siguro ng 60 or to make sure na hindi complete free fall yung itong US dollar peso exchange natin. Now, this is important because what's happening with the Philippine peso will also have an impact on inflation because yung import cost natin, ang Pilipinas kasi mas marami tayong na-import kaysa export, so net importing country tayo, especially sa food and basic commodities, which mini-measure ng CPI, yung Consumer Price Index na basis ng inflation measurement. So if the peso goes weaker and weaker, mas mahaling imports natin, and that's going to put more and more pressure dun sa inflation picture natin. So far, the picture is mixed in a sense that the increase, the 75 basis point dun sa US Federal Reserve did not create the kind of currency crash that some people were expecting na abot ng 65, 67, 67, 68. We're still keeping it below 60%. And one of the reasons is because ang Department of Finance the other week actually announced, our head of Department of Finance announced that the Philippine government will be willing to make interventions, including by willing to deploy up to $10 billion of our reserves to defend that currency, no? So ito yung pangako ng Philippine. So sa Bloomberg yun, si Jokno, yung ating finance secretary who was formerly our BSP governor and who's also the monetary board if I'm not mistaken. Ang sabi niya is the Philippines is willing to use $10 billion to defend the currency. So we're willing to burn $10 billion to keep the Philippine peso strong. Para kung lumabas yung US dollar ng mga US investors dito or foreign investors, we'll use our own dollar currencies to keep it up. No? So I think that statement was very important, very powerful. And at the same time, in fairness naman, pagdating naman sa Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, nagpaakyat din sila ng kanilang interest rate para tapatan yung pag-akyat naman sa US. Now, of course, that's not a good news for domestic borrowers in the Philippines. Sa atin yung mga may credit card, may loan, may bayad, it's not good. Of course, it's difficult. But at least, it's somehow protecting yung Philippine peso from breaching the 60 points. So, the government drew the line, and I think they're optimistic by December, once yung mga ating mga kababayan, especially mga OFWs, mga ating mga bayani, once they send back more dollars home, that will give the government more cushion, more room for maneuver, more room for intervention. So yun po yung nakikita natin. That's why ang dollar ay mukhang hindi abot sa 65, 67, 68 anytime soon, no? So we correctly predicted that the 75 basis point is coming at this point. But mukhang the skepticism we had about it going 65, 68 was correct. In fact, it has been kept below 60% because the government can do something. Yan ang parati natin sinasabi. May magagawa ang gobyerno naman. Hindi naman helpless ang Pilipinas. May limitasyon dun sa pwede natin gawin, pero kung proactive yung government natin, there could be ways to help defend the Philippine peso. Again, walang libre. There's no free lunch in economics. So we are actually potentially exhausting a significant part of our dollar reserves that we could use for imports, for other things in the future, for emergency purposes, to defend the peso right now. Now, defending the peso is very, very important because umakyat din itong inflation natin to a 14-year high. And of course, that's an increasingly political issue dito sa Pilipinas because yung critics ni Bongbong ay sinisisi ang gobyerno for everything that is going wrong. Now, I'm not saying the government is completely blameless. For instance, Singapore, their monetary authorities were very proactive early on, so they were able to defend their currency much better than the Philippines and a lot of countries. And then, so may mga gawa ng government, but to always say na everything that goes wrong is because of the government also misses the point because there's structural elements there. So yung Philippine inflation rate ay nag-spike to 14-year high of 7.7% last month. At ito ay dahil sa confluence of many factors, no? Yung rising cost ng yung imports from abroad, yung syempre related din yan dun sa nangyari sa OPEC, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, yung Saudi Arabia's reduction of its oil output in conjunction with also Russia. So maraming factors are unfortunately coming together and putting a lot of pressure on the Philippines. Sabi ni NEDA Secretary Arsenio Balisacan, our immediate priority is to continue supporting the most vulnerable sectors of the economy, hence the cash transfer and fuel discounts will continue. This will alleviate the effects of the sustained increase in commodity prices as a result of global headwinds, as well as the recent typhoons which damaged our domestic production and disrupted food supply. So, meron din ng additional elements. So, siguro, now obviously, itong impact ng typhoon, I don't think it's fully reflected sa October numbers, but in the November numbers, you might see the effect of that more visible. Nonetheless, ang Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas po ay nag-release ng statement earlier today saying that the situation over the long run, or actually medium run, may not be as bad. And they're expecting that by 2024, the situation will stabilize pagdating sa inflation. And actually, as early as 2023, maybe there'll be a moderation in terms of the inflation picture. So, ito yung statement ng Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. I-post natin dito. Kameta, para makita niyo naman yung mga sinasabi ng ating gobyerno, para ma-appreciate nyo naman, para you-keep updated. Siyempre, ito yung trabaho natin, di ba? To keep updated on yung mga latest na nangyari, para we can also keep you updated, and you can read, of course, on your own. So, I'm gonna post the links later on. So, yung Bangko Sentral, may statement kanina, slightly optimistic that the situation will improve next year. So ayon sa Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, inflation is projected to remain elevated for the rest of 2022. So November and December, unfortunately, mataas pa rin. Of course, sa holiday season, mataas na rin dahil the demand will be very high for a lot of basic goods. So that's going to be one big concern that we're going to have, ating mga kameta, right? But the situation also with OPEC, yung oil prices, yung situation sa food supply from Ukraine, from Russia, yung fertilizers, yung mga yan, hindi rin mawawala in the foreseeable future. So ayon sa Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, this is due to easing global oil and non-oil prices, negative base effects from transport fare adjustments in 2022, and as the impact of BSP's commodity rate projects take hold. Okay, ang point rin ng kasi ng Bangko Sentral is yung increase nila ng interest rate nila to protect the Philippine peso somehow, and also to help domestic inflation situation. Yung effect niya will not be felt right away. So it might take some time, maybe early next year, no? Pero sabi nila, yung projected outlook nila is they are seen to be broadly balanced for 2024. So a downward trajectory in 2023. But for the rest of 2020, for the next 2, 3, 4 months, mukhang high inflation is what we have to expect. So siguro in the 7 to 8% range. Ayon sa Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, it remains prepared to take full monetary policy actions, increasing interest rates, of course, among others, to bring inflation back to the target over the medium term. The BSP also continues to strongly urge the timely implementation of non-monetary government interventions to mitigate the impact of persistent supply-side pressures on inflation. So in short, hindi naman lahat pwede umasa na lang sa Bangko Sentral kasi monetary policy limited lang pwede nilang gawin, although as important as it is. But the government also has to do something to deal with dun sa supply issues. So kung may mga nag-hoard dyan, mga loko-loko dyan, or kung there are ways to enhance yung domestic production capacity. There are ways to, for instance, to better negotiate import of fertilizers, of food from Vietnam, from some of our counterparts from India, etc. Then let's go, no? Also, of course, the government has to come up with other measures to protect yung mga pinaka-vulnerable, pinaka-apektado dito. Ako naman, just a kind of a closing remark. It kind of goes back to the debate we had with some of our economist friends here. Local economist friends here who seem to be very adamant that, A is A and, let's not talk about anything else. Ganun. Ang point ko naman dito is, the inflation crisis, I mean, thank God we're not having inflation like Turkey, di ba? Mga 60%, 70%, whatever. Or yung mga Zimbabwe level, 1,000%. So, 7-8% is bad, but nowhere as bad as what some other countries have been experiencing, including Turkey, no, in recent years. Akin naman, the 7.7% or even 10% inflation would not be too bad if marami sa ating kababayan ay may cushion. If marami sa ating kababayan have enough savings. If marami sa ating kababayan have well-paying salaries. If marami sa ating kababayan ay welfare from the government, all their other kind of supportive mechanisms. Kasi ganito guys if umakyat ang inflation by 10%, pero yung sahod mo nag-increase by 30% or 20% or even 15%, you're still beating inflation. Ang problema kasi dito is yung real wages ay hindi umakyat. Ibig sabihin yan, kasi yung nominal wage increases that, kunyari, tumaas ang sahod mo ng 20%, pero kung tumaas ang inflation na 30%, lugi ka pa rin. Di ba? May 50% na higher pa rin na inflation. So, magka-cancel out yan. So, lugi ka pa. But, let's say, 30% inflation, pero yung sahod mo ay nag-increase by 50%. Then, there's that 20% differential. So, yung real wage mo ay actually nag-increase by that 20% na yan. You get what I'm saying? So, ang problema kasi dito sa Pilipinas is that yung real wages ay hindi nag-increase. So, even though medyo umaakyat yung sahod, mas umaakyat yung inflation. Pero kung sana umaakyat yung sahod ng taong bayan, kung sana marami sa ating kababayan may savings, may cushion, etc., which is almost close to impossible dahil ang mahal ng real estate sa Philippines, ang mahal ng expenditures dito sa Manila. We have one of the highest living costs in the region. Next to Singapore, Manila is considered the most expensive. So it's very hard for marami sa ating kababayan to save enough, no? So the Philippines has a big problem kung saan ang taas ng gastusin, yung sahod hindi umakyat ng masyado. So yung real wages are stagnating. So when the inflation goes at 6-7%, ang laki ng impact sa atin. But in other countries kasi, even if mataas yung inflation, umakyat yung value ng real estate nila or umakyat yung value ng savings nila dahil mataas ang interest rates or umakyat pa yung sahod nila, then it's not as painful. So again, the Turkish case is kind of weird. But in Turkey, what's interesting is that even though the inflation is horrible, 60-70%, some would even say 100+%, real estate prices are also going very up. So marami sa kanilang middle class who have houses and real estate, they're also getting richer. So every day is more expensive, but they're way wealthier in terms of their net worth. More than that, wages are also increasing pretty decently. So it allows for a lot of people to be competitive even though the inflation is increasing. But important also there, particularly in the case of Turkey, is marami sa mga Turks also may savings. So even though mataas ang inflation, kung mataas ang bigay na interest rate ng mga banks, yung kikitain mo sa bank sa interest rate, pwede mo pang bawi yan sa inflation. Do you get what I'm saying? So it's not the inflation per se that is bad, although 6-7% is definitely not good. But the fact that real wages are really low, the fact that wages are not increasing faster than inflation, the fact that marami sa ating kababayan don't have enough savings, therefore they're not enjoying also very high interest rates. And not to mention their interest rates in the banks on deposit is also very low in the Philippines compared to what we have in places like Turkey. And the fact that marami sa ating kababayan also do not have their own properties, etc., they could not also take advantage of a rise in property costs as a kind of cushion, no? Because that's what we're seeing in Turkey, and that's very interesting. So on one hand, you can say Turkey is a complete crisis situation. On the other hand, the middle class is not as hurting as people expect with the 60-70% inflation, because a lot of them have properties, a lot of them have savings, they're getting a lot of interest rate on that, and their wage increase over the years has been decent enough. So what I'm saying is that you have to understand the inflation within a bigger picture. And I suggest you guys to check an opinion ed for you to understand what I'm saying. Again, I'm not saying we should be Turkey, ha? Ito na naman yung mga trolls or yung mga feeling dyan na ano, diba? I'll show you more data on Turkey later on. Ito. So ito kasi marami pinagtatawanan si Erdogan kasi si Erdogan medyo unconventional approach. I'm not defending Erdogan. You know, I have my own ideas on Erdogan. But interestingly, more and more economists and people are seriously looking at the data are saying maybe what Erdogan is doing maybe the inflation situation in Turkey is not as bad because there are other mitigating factors. High interest rate for relatively high levels of savings for the middle class. Real wage increase is not as bad, and also real estate costs are going high, and since most people have houses in major cities in Turkey, nakakabawi sila kasi yung property prices nila tumataas, so nagbe-benefit sila. So I really suggest you guys to read this very interesting article by an Indian writer. Turkey's monetary experience holds lesson for Asia's central bank. So what you think sometimes is crazy, all out of this world, or you think it's end of the world because inflation is 67%. It's not enough to just look at the inflation. You have to look at the bigger picture. You have to look at real wages. You look at property costs. Prices. You have to look at interest rates on saving. You have to look at the saving rate. So you have to have a very comprehensive understanding of what's going on in the bigger economic picture before you make a kind of statement on inflation. Now, in the case of the Philippines, kasi unfortunately, yung mga sahod ay hindi umakyat significantly. Not many people have properties, and the interest rates of banks on deposit is also not as high. Kaya talaga masakit itong 7%, 6%, 7%, 8%. But all I'm saying is that there's a bigger economic picture we also always have to keep in mind when we're talking about inflation. As bad as inflation is, if yung mga sahod natin ay mas mabilis umakyat sa inflation, if we beat the inflation, then maybe the situation will not be as bad. So for me, the inflation is a bad thing, but it's also a symptom of a more fundamental problem, which is very low saving rates, very low interest rates in the bank on deposits for those who have savings. Also, not many people having properties or cushion or enough savings to even deal with inflation. And kulang din yung subsidies and interventions ng government for many reasons. Hindi ko rin masisisi itong Marcos administration for the limitations they face, structural limitations they face, because hindi naman kasalanan ni Marcos nagkaroon ng giyera sa Russia. Hindi rin kasalanan ni Marcos na ang dami niyang utang na inherit from tatay, which makes it hard for the government to make massive interventions, monetary, fiscal, social interventions to mitigate yung impact ng inflation. So what I'm saying is that it's a little bit more complicated than it's all the fault of Marcos, or let's just look at inflation and ignore other issues. No, you have to look at real wages. You have to look at interest rates on savings. You look at the saving rates of people. You have to look how many are middle class, etc. So on and so forth. So yun yung bigger picture na gusto natin makita. And in fairness, at least naman dun sa Philippine peso to dollar, mukhang we're avoiding so far the 60 peso threshold. And that's partly thanks to Department of Finance statements by Secretary Jokno, and also kudos to Bangko Sentral for doing its part. Yun lang. Alright, mga kameta, let me say thank you dun sa mga nakinig sa atin. I know it's a little bit technical, etc. But actually, it's not that complicated. Economists want to make you think that what they're doing is so complicated. Actually, it's not. Right? It's not that complicated. If you just understand the basic dynamics, you'll appreciate that economics is actually a beautiful thing. And us as ordinary citizens, we have to have a basic understanding of the economic forces so that we can also make the right judgment and right decisions also on what kind of leaders we have. Also decisions in terms of your savings, in terms of your expenditures, etc. So maraming salamat dun sa mga sumusuporta sa atin, kay Manay Shes, thank you kay Annabel Gamoras Forever for joining us, kay Romina Gloria Manalo Bondat for joining us, thanks to Riz Annie as always, kay Noemi Tablate, kay Ma'am Jocelyn Lomberes. Salamat sa inyong lahat. Thank you so much sa lahat ng mga sumali sa atin. So, it's a mixed picture and not totally surprising dun sa inflation situation. Again, post ko lang itong Bangko Sentral. Fina-follow kasi tayo ng Bangko Sentral. Kasi alam natin. Tatawa ako. Ito yung mga local economies. Binaba na tayo. Tapos, actually, fina-follow ako ng Bangko Sentral. Ayan, fina-follow tayo. Diba? Ayan. Follows you. Yan ang level natin, mga kameta. Fina-follow tayo ng mga ganyan. Diba? Diba? Ganyan tayo eh. Ganyan lang naman yung levels natin eh. Tapos, ewan ko talaga. Ito. Ay, hindi ko pa na-share. Saan yan? Ayan, ito. Share ko yan para pwede natin gamitin dyan, mga kameta. Mga kameta. Okay, makinig dun sa mga local na purong lang. Pinapakomplicate nila. Hindi naman nila intindihan bigger global macroeconomic picture. Yan, tayo dyan. Diba? Tayo global thinkers. Ayan, salamat since fina-follow tayo ng Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Share din natin mamaya. Baka binabasa tayo ng Bangko Sentral friends natin dyan. Diba? Ito. Ay, wait lang. Nasaan pumunta? So ito yung assurances and ito yung outlook. So please pay attention to that because based on that you can make some educated guess about the direction of things. So, ito po yung statement ng Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas dun sa medium-term inflation outlook. No? Paki-check yan, mga kameta. Ipopost ko rin dyan sa baba para ma-appreciate nyo yung direction ng ating ekonomiya. So, sabi niya, the risk to inflation outlook appears to be tilted to the upside for 2020-23 but are seen to be broadly balanced for 2024. So, mukhang ba 2023 it's not going to be that nice. The potential impact of higher global and non-oil prices, additional transport fare hikes, increased food prices owing to weather disturbances, and sharp rise in sugar prices are the major upside risks to the inflation upside risk, meaning pinapataas yung inflation. Meanwhile, the impact of a weaker than expected global economic recovery is the primary downward risk to the outlook. So there is a possibility the inflation goes down, but the cause of that will be economic recession globally and slowdown in Philippine economic growth. No, so always be careful what you wish for. No, sometimes in our obsession with inflation, we forget that the more important thing even is to make sure we earn, our economy goes forward, and our wages increases faster than inflation. Yun po ang pinakamahalaga, no? Yung real wages, yun ang talaga mahalaga if you want to look at the impact of inflation on ordinary people. If the real wages grow faster, then we can beat inflation. But if the real wages are not going fast enough and your nominal wages are canceled out by even higher inflation, then wala rin. Okay? Alright. So, yun lang. Kasi yung iba dyan, nagpa-populist style eh. Parang gusto lang i-blame si Marcos, gusto lang i-blame yung inflation, but they're forgetting their more important things, which is real wages, which is, other indicators and factors that we talk about. So, So, ito pina-follow lang naman tayo dyan ng Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Ganyan lang naman mga levels natin eh. Sorry mga ka-vloggers, dun sa mga local economists na very expert and magaling. Okay, alright. Ayoko na magbardagulan. Thank you very much, guys. I'll talk to you soon. Have a good night. Ayan, magna 9 p.m. na. Pahinga na ako. Meron akong morning engagements and all. Again, sorry mga kameta kung late tayo nag-join. May class ako ng 5 to 8 p.m. so I couldn't join you earlier. So, yun. But see, humabol talaga ako kasi mahal ko kayo. So, thank you so much dun sa mga nagbigay ng stars, nagbigay ng support and comments, suggestions. I really appreciate and hope again we can have a StreamYard soon and we can have back and forth discussion. Alright? God bless. Salamat. Talk to you soon.